ancient deserts of the Negev, where the scorching sun met the rugged hills of southern Canaan, a fierce people arose, the Amalekites. Descended from Esau's lineage, they roamed the arid lands between Egypt and Edom, mastering the art of survival through ruthless warfare and relentless raids. When Israel, weary from slavery, crossed their path, the Amalekites struck without mercy. But in defying God's chosen people, they sealed their own fate, a curse that would echo through the ages. Could they escape divine judgment? The Amalekites were one of the earliest and most persistent enemies of Israel, known for their cruelty, cunning, and ability to thrive in the harshest of environments. Their origin is traced back to Amalek, the son of Eliphaz, who was the son of Esau, as recorded in Genesis 36. Verse 12, "And Timnah was concubine to Eliphaz Esau's son, and she bare to Eliphaz Amalek. These were the sons of Adah, Esau's wife." As a descendant of Esau, Amalek inherited a legacy of rivalry, one that had begun generations before, when Esau, the elder twin of Jacob, sold his birthright for a meal and later burned with resentment towards his brother. The Amalekites, as his progeny, carried this animosity in their blood, becoming a nation that would war against Jacob's descendants for centuries. The name Amalek itself carries deep significance. While the exact meaning is debated, many scholars believe it signifies dweller in the valley or warrior people, both of which align with their nature and way of life. The Amalekites were not a sedentary kingdom, but rather nomadic raiders who thrived in the wilderness. Unlike the great cities of Mesopotamia or the fortified strongholds of the Canaanites, they moved across the deserts, striking without warning and vanishing into the vast emptiness before their victims could retaliate. They understood the desert like no other, using its unforgiving terrain to their advantage, ambushing trade caravans, plundering settlements, and even challenging mighty nations that dared to pass through their lands. Their culture was one built on strength, dominance, and warfare. Amalekite society was ruled by tribal chieftains, and their leadership structure was likely based on the mightiest warrior taking precedence. The strongest ruled, and power was maintained through sheer force. They were relentless in their pursuit of wealth and dominance, raiding not for mere survival, but as a way of life. This made them feared throughout the ancient Near East. Unlike the Israelites, whose governance was shaped by divine laws and the priesthood, the Amalekites lived by the sword, enforcing authority through violence and intimidation. Their settlements, if they had any permanent ones, would have been small and scattered, allowing them to remain mobile and elusive. Religion played a significant role in their identity, though little is recorded about the exact nature of their deities. Given their proximity to Canaan and Edom, it is highly likely that they worshipped gods similar to those of their neighbors. Baal, the storm and fertility god of the Canaanites, may have been honored among them, as well as other deities tied to war and destruction. The Amalekites were not a people known for temples or elaborate religious rituals, but rather for invoking their gods in battle, seeking favor for their raids and conquests. Their worship may have included sacrificial offerings before war, seeking omens, and performing brutal rites to appease the spirits they believed controlled their fate. Their religious beliefs, much like their existence, were steeped in bloodshed and violence. Their reputation as raiders and pillagers was known throughout the region. The Amalekites had no interest in building a peaceful civilization. Their strength was in taking from others. They were not farmers or builders, but warriors, and their survival depended on their ability to overpower and plunder those who stood in their path. Unlike the Egyptians, who built grand monuments, or the Israelites, who sought a land flowing with milk and honey, the Amalekites thrived on destruction. They were nomadic but never passive, striking at vulnerable settlements and travelers without mercy. Their strategy was to attack swiftly, take what they needed, and disappear into the wilderness, making pursuit nearly impossible. This made them one of the most dreaded enemies of the ancient world, for they could strike anywhere, at any time, and with brutal efficiency. Their presence in biblical history is marked by relentless hostility toward Israel. Even before Israel had established itself as a nation, the Amalekites had already declared war upon them. They saw the Israelites, fresh out of Egyptian bondage and struggling to survive in the wilderness, as easy prey. They did not hesitate to exploit the weakness of the weary travelers, targeting the slowest and most vulnerable among them. In Deuteronomy 25, verse 17 to 18, God reminds Israel of their treachery. Remember what Amalek did unto thee by the way, when ye were come forth out of Egypt, how he met thee by the way, and smote the hindmost of thee, even all that were feeble behind thee, when thou wast faint and weary, and he feared not God. Their attack was not a battle of honor, but an act of cowardice, striking at the defenseless in a cruel and calculated act of war. For this, God placed a divine curse upon the Amalekites, declaring that their name would one day be blotted out from under heaven. Unlike other enemies of Israel, who would later find moments of reconciliation or mercy, the Amalekites were marked for total destruction. They had not only opposed Israel, but they had challenged God himself. Their survival was a direct affront to his will, and their ultimate fate was sealed from the moment they raised their hands against his chosen people. This marked the beginning of an unending war, one that would see the Amalekites become Israel's most persistent and most hated adversary. Their brutal methods, their relentless attacks, and their utter disregard for God set them apart from other nations that warred with Israel. The Philistines sought land, the Moabites desired political alliances, and the Egyptians were a mighty empire with vast resources. But the Amalekites? They existed purely to destroy. They lived by the sword and sought nothing but chaos. This was not just a political enemy, but a spiritual one. A people that embodied rebellion against God and hostility toward his covenant people. Yet for all their ferocity, the Amalekites were doomed from the start. They could plunder, they could raid, and they could fight, but they could not escape the judgment of the Almighty. Their story is one of war, pride, and an inescapable fate. They believed themselves untouchable, feared by nations and masters of the wilderness. But their greatest mistake was thinking they could war against God and survive. The sands of time would one day erase their name, as God had decreed. Their legacy would not be one of triumph, but of judgment. This is the beginning of the story of the Amalekites, a people whose cruelty knew no bounds, whose thirst for violence shaped their entire existence, and whose defiance of divine authority led to their ultimate downfall. They rose from the harsh deserts, thrived in war, and became Israel's most dreaded enemy. But no enemy of God can stand forever. The Amalekites had set themselves on a path of destruction, and nothing they did could change their fate. The war between them and Israel would span generations, but in the end, only one would remain. The Amalekites struck without warning. Israel, weary and weak after escaping the bondage of Egypt, had barely begun its journey through the wilderness when the relentless warriors of Amalek descended upon them. This was no ordinary battle. It was a calculated ambush, one that sought to annihilate a defenseless people who had just tasted freedom. The attack took place at Refidim, a barren and rocky region near Mount Horeb, where the Israelites had recently experienced the miraculous provision of water from a rock at the command of Moses. But as they rejoiced in God's provision, an enemy lurked in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. In Exodus 17, verse 8, the Word of God records the moment when Israel faced its first great war. Then came Amalek and fought with Israel in Rephidim. This was not an act of mere territorial defense or political rivalry. It was a merciless assault on a people who had done nothing to provoke them. The Amalekites did not challenge Israel in open combat, where warriors could face one another in honorable battle. Instead, they employed a cruel and cowardly strategy. As recounted in Deuteronomy 25, verse 17 to 18, they deliberately targeted the most vulnerable. Remember what Amalek did unto thee by the way, when ye were come forth out of Egypt, how he met thee by the way, and smote the hindmost of thee, even all that were feeble behind thee, when thou wast faint and weary, and he feared not God. They struck from behind, cutting down the elderly, the women, the children, those who could not defend themselves. This was an act of terror, an attempt to cripple Israel before it could establish itself as a nation. The Amalekites knew what they were doing. They had seen how Israel had left Egypt, a mass of former slaves with no military training, no structured army, no experience in warfare. But they had also witnessed the mighty hand of God that had brought plagues upon Pharaoh and split the Red Sea in two. They had heard of the destruction of Egypt, yet they feared not the God of Israel. Instead, they chose to attack his people, believing that their own strength and knowledge of desert warfare would give them the upper hand. This was not just a physical war, it was a spiritual one, a direct challenge to the authority of the Almighty. Moses, upon realizing the gravity of the situation, called upon Joshua, his trusted servant and a warrior in the making. In Exodus 17 verse 9, Moses gives his command. And Moses said unto Joshua, Choose us out men, and go out, fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of God in mine hand. This would be Joshua's first recorded battle, the first time he would lead men into war. He gathered as many able-bodied men as he could, knowing that they were up against a ruthless and battle-hardened enemy. The Amalekites had the advantage of experience, but Israel had something far greater: divine intervention. As the battle raged on, Moses climbed to the top of a nearby hill, holding the rod of God in his hand. What happened next was nothing short of miraculous. In Exodus 17 verse 11, the Bible reveals a profound mystery. And it came to pass, when Moses held up his hand, that Israel prevailed, and when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. It was not the strength of Israel's warriors nor the strategy of Joshua that determined the outcome of the battle. Victory came only when Moses kept his hands lifted high, a sign of intercession and dependence on God. But as the hours passed, his arms grew heavy, and whenever they fell, the Amalekites gained the advantage. Seeing this, Aaron and Hur, his loyal companions, rushed to his side. They placed a stone for him to sit upon and held up his arms so that the rod of God would remain lifted. The battle lasted from sunrise to sunset, an intense struggle between a newly freed nation and a relentless enemy. But as long as Moses' hands remained raised, the power of God flowed through Israel, granting them the strength to fight. In Exodus 17 verse 13, the result is made clear. And Joshua discomfited Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. The enemy was defeated, but this was only the beginning. This was not a war that would end with a single battle. Amalek had committed a grave sin, one that would bring the wrath of God upon their entire lineage. As the dust settled and the cries of battle faded, God spoke to Moses, issuing a decree that would seal the fate of the Amalekites forever. In Exodus 17 verse 14, he declared, Write this for a memorial in a book, and rehearse it in the ears of Joshua, for I will utterly put out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. The judgment was set. The Amalekites had not simply attacked Israel, they had defied God. And for this, their existence would one day be erased from history. This was not just a temporary punishment, but an eternal curse, a divine declaration that they would never escape the consequences of their actions. Moses, in obedience to God's command, built an altar and named it Jehovah Nissi, meaning, "The Lord is my banner." This altar was a sign that the victory belonged to God, not to men. And then came the chilling prophecy in Exodus 17, verse 16. For he said, "Because the Lord hath sworn that the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation." This was not the last time Israel would face them. The Battle of Refidim was only the first of many conflicts that would span centuries, a war that would only end when the last of the Amalekites was wiped from the earth. The Amalekites had made a fatal mistake. They had believed that their cunning, their desert warfare, and their ruthlessness would be enough to destroy Israel. But they had underestimated the power of God. Their actions had set into motion a divine decree that could not be undone. The curse of Amalek was now woven into history, an unbreakable judgment that would follow them from one generation to the next. They would continue to rise, continue to attack, but each time they did, they would come closer to their own annihilation. Israel, though victorious, had learned a crucial lesson. This war was not fought with swords alone. The real battle was fought in the realm of the spiritual. As long as they relied on God, they would prevail. But the moment they turned from Him, their enemies would gain the upper hand. The Amalekites had been the first to attack them. but they would not be the last. The road ahead was long, filled with trials and enemies yet unseen. But on that day at Refidim they had seen firsthand that the power of God was greater than any army, greater than any earthly strength. And so the name of Amalek was cursed, doomed to fade into the sands of history as the hand of God moved to erase them forever. Now, the decree of destruction had been set, but the final judgment had not yet come. The war between Israel and Amalek was far from over. The curse placed upon them in the wilderness would follow them through the centuries, leading to moments of temporary survival, desperate revenge, and ultimate downfall. And though they believed they could outrun the hand of God, their fate was already written. They would rise again, but their fall would be even greater. The war against Amalek was far from over. Though the Israelites had secured victory at Refidim through divine intervention, the Amalekites remained a lingering threat. Their enmity with Israel was not a passing conflict, but a deep-seated hatred that would stretch across generations. The decree given by God after their ambush at Rephidim was not just a warning, it was a judgment. The Amalekites had positioned themselves not only as enemies of Israel, but as enemies of God himself, and for that they were marked for destruction. The eternal curse against Amalek was reiterated in the book of Deuteronomy, where God commanded Israel never to forget what had been done to them. In Deuteronomy 25, verse 17-19, the severity of their crime is underscored. Remember what Amalek did unto thee by the way, when ye were come forth out of Egypt, how he met thee by the way, and smote the hindmost of thee, even all that were feeble behind thee, when thou wast faint and weary, and he feared not God. Therefore it shall be, when the Lord thy God hath given thee rest from all thine enemies round about, in the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance to possess it, that thou shalt blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. Thou shalt not forget it. This was a divine command, not merely an instruction of self-defense. Israel was not to view Amalek as just another enemy, but as a people under divine judgment. Their actions at Rephidim had sealed their fate, and their existence was now an abomination before God. This was a unique decree in the Bible. Other nations that opposed Israel, whether the Philistines, Moabites, or Canaanites, were at times judged, but none carried the weight of Amalek's eternal condemnation. The reason was clear. They had attacked the defenseless, they had opposed God's chosen people without cause, and most significantly, they had feared not God. The phrase, "Thou shalt blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven," was not a metaphor. It was a direct command for Israel to one day erase them from history entirely. But the destruction of Amalek was not to happen all at once. Their survival in the centuries that followed would be a testament to their persistent defiance and Israel's failure to carry out God's judgment in full. The curse set in Deuteronomy would loom over Israel's history, influencing military campaigns, royal decrees, and prophetic warnings. The opposition between Israel and Amalek was not just a physical war, it was a spiritual war. Amalek's defiance of God represented more than a historical battle. It symbolized rebellion against divine authority. Throughout Scripture, Amalek is not only mentioned as an enemy of Israel, but as an embodiment of wickedness. Many Jewish and Christian scholars interpret Amalek as a symbol of evil, pride, and defiance against God's plan. The Amalekites did not fear the God of Israel, and in their refusal to submit, they became an enduring representation of opposition to righteousness. This deeper meaning explains why God commanded Israel never to forget Amalek. Their name was to be blotted out, yet their sin was to be remembered. This paradox was intentional. Israel was to ensure their physical destruction while also keeping the memory of their treachery alive as a warning. This was more than just retribution. It was justice. The Amalekites had set themselves against the purposes of God, and as long as they existed, they would continue to threaten his people. The curse upon Amalek set the stage for centuries of conflict. They would rise again and again, striking at Israel with the same ruthlessness they had shown in the wilderness. Though weakened, they would never stop seeking Israel's destruction. But no matter how many times they returned, the shadow of God's judgment followed them. Their ultimate end was written long before they realized it. The war against Amalek was not over. It had only just begun. The Amalekites did not fade into obscurity after their defeat at Refidim. Though marked for destruction, they persisted, lurking in the wilderness, waiting for opportunities to strike again. Their war against Israel was not a single battle, but an ongoing campaign of terror, marked by raids, ambushes, and strategic alliances with other hostile nations. As Israel settled into the Promised Land, the Amalekites refused to be erased. They would continue their relentless oppression, finding new ways to challenge God's people and defy the divine judgment that had been placed upon them. During the time of the Judges, the Amalekites resurfaced as a formidable enemy, often aligning themselves with other nations that sought Israel's downfall. One such alliance was with the Moabites, who despised Israel's growing influence in the land. In Judges 3 verse 12-13, the Bible records how God allowed Israel to fall into the hands of its enemies due to their disobedience. And the children of Israel did evil again in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord strengthened Eglon the king of Moab against Israel, because they had done evil in the sight of the Lord. And he gathered unto him the children of Ammon and Amalek, and went and smote Israel, and possessed the city of palm trees. The Amalekites, never ones to miss an opportunity for plunder, joined Moab in this invasion, helping to subjugate Israel and claim their cities. Their tactics had not changed. They thrived in the chaos of war, seizing goods, enslaving the weak, and striking wherever they could cause the most destruction. They were not conquerors looking to settle, but marauders seeking to take what they could before vanishing into the wilderness. The city of palm trees, known as Jericho, fell under their occupation, a humiliating defeat for Israel. Israel, now under the harsh rule of these oppressors, cried out to God for deliverance. In response, he raised up a judge named Ehud, who assassinated King Eglon of Moab and led a revolt that freed Israel from its subjugation. With Moab defeated, the Amalekites were once again driven back into the desert, but their enmity did not wane. They would wait for another moment of weakness, another lapse in Israel's faithfulness, to return and strike once more. Their chance came again during the time of Gideon. By this time, the Amalekites had joined forces with yet another enemy, the Midianites. The Midianites were a powerful nomadic people who, like the Amalekites, thrived on raiding and pillaging. Together, these two forces unleashed a devastating campaign of terror against Israel, described vividly in Judges 6 verse 1-5. And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them into the hand of Midian 7 years. And the hand of Midian prevailed against Israel, and because of the Midianites, the children of Israel made them the dens which are in the mountains, and caves, and strongholds. And so it was, when Israel had sown, that the Midianites and the Amalekites and the children of the east came up against them, and they encamped against them, and destroyed the increase of the earth, till thou come unto Gaza, and left no sustenance for Israel, neither sheep, nor ox, nor ass. For they came up with their cattle and their tents, and they came as grasshoppers for multitude. For both they and their camels were without number, and they entered into the land to destroy it. This was economic warfare at its worst. The Amalekites, alongside their Midianite allies, did not seek merely to defeat Israel in battle. Instead, they implemented a strategy of starvation and devastation. Every year, just as Israel's crops reached harvest time, the Amalekites and Midianites would sweep down from the desert, raiding the land, burning fields, slaughtering livestock, and leaving Israel utterly destitute. This was a slow, systematic destruction designed to break Israel's will and keep them in perpetual poverty and fear. The people of Israel were so overwhelmed that they were forced to abandon their homes and live in hiding. They sought refuge in caves, mountains, and strongholds, unable to resist the unstoppable waves of raiders. The land that had once been promised to them, flowing with milk and honey, was now a land of scarcity and despair. The Amalekites, ever opportunistic, thrived on this devastation, growing rich off stolen goods and ensuring that Israel remained weak and vulnerable. But Israel had one hope left: their God. Once again, in their desperation, they cried out to the Lord for deliverance, and he answered by calling forth an unlikely hero. Gideon, A man from the weakest family in his tribe was chosen to stand against the mighty armies of Midian and Amalek. When the angel of the Lord appeared to him, he addressed him with unexpected words in Judges 6 verse 12. "The Lord is with thee, thou mighty man of valor." Gideon, at first reluctant and doubtful, would soon become the instrument of God's justice, bringing about one of the most astonishing victories in Israel's history. Though the Amalekites had once again risen against Israel, their time of reckoning was drawing near. They believed themselves untouchable, masters of the desert and lords of raiding warfare. But they had underestimated the power of the God they had defied for generations. The battle that was about to take place would prove once again that Amalek could never escape divine judgment. The stage was set. Israel's deliverer had been chosen, and the Amalekites, despite their strength and numbers, would soon learn that no army, no strategy, and no alliance could stand against the will of the Almighty. Their war against Israel had continued for generations, but this time, their defeat would be unlike any they had ever faced before. Gideon, now assured of his divine calling, gathered an army to confront the Midianites and Amalekites. Though the enemy was vast, covering the valley like a swarm of locusts, Gideon was determined to free Israel from their tormentors. Initially, he assembled 32,000 men, but God had other plans. In Judges 7 verse 2, the Lord declared, "The people that are with thee are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel vaunt themselves against me, saying, Mine own hand hath saved me." God did not want Israel to claim victory by their own strength. He would show them that deliverance comes from Him alone. At God's command, Gideon told the men that anyone who was afraid could leave. 22,000 departed, leaving only 10,000 to face an army that numbered beyond count. But even this was too many. God commanded Gideon to take his men down to the water where he would test them. Those who lapped the water like dogs were separated from those who knelt to drink. Only 300 men passed this test. In human terms, this was an absurd strategy, 300 against a multitude. But God's ways are higher than man's ways. This battle would be won not by numbers, but by faith. That night, Gideon and his servant crept into the enemy camp, and what they overheard filled them with confidence. In Judges 7 verse 13-14, they heard an Amalekite soldier telling a dream in which a loaf of barley bread tumbled into the Midianite camp, overturning a tent. Another soldier interpreted the dream, saying, "This is nothing else save the sword of Gideon the son of Joash, a man of Israel. For into his hand hath God delivered Midian and all the host." Even the enemy knew that divine power was against them. With this confirmation, Gideon divided his 300 men into 3 companies, each armed with nothing but a trumpet, a pitcher, and a torch. At the appointed time, they surrounded the enemy camp and, on Gideon's signal, blew their trumpets, broke their pitchers to reveal their torches, and shouted, "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon." The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The Amalekites, Midianites, and other allied forces awoke in terror, believing a massive army had surrounded them. Confusion swept through their ranks, and in their panic they turned their swords against one another. The once feared warriors of Amalek were thrown into complete chaos. Some fled into the desert, but Gideon and his men pursued them relentlessly. In Judges 7 verse 22 it is recorded, "And the 300 blew the trumpets, and the Lord set every man's sword against his fellow, even throughout all the host. And the host fled to Bethshittah in Zerath, and to the border of Abel-Meholah unto Tabbath." The once mighty raiders who had tormented Israel for years were utterly destroyed, not by the strength of Israel's army, but by the hand of God. The victory was decisive. The Amalekites, who had long tormented Israel with their ruthless raids, had suffered a devastating blow. Though some remnants would continue to exist, their power was broken, their alliances shattered, and their dominion over Israel ended. The prophecy that had followed them since the days of Moses, that they would be wiped out from under heaven, was coming closer to fulfillment. This battle was not just about delivering Israel from oppression. It was another step in the divine judgment that had been spoken over Amalek. The lesson of Gideon's victory was clear. No enemy, no matter how strong, can stand against God's will. The Amalekites had sought to destroy Israel through deception, economic warfare, and relentless raids, but in the end, their strength became their downfall. They had placed their faith in their numbers, their alliances, and their brutal tactics, but none of these could withstand the power of the Almighty. Though they had been defeated, the Amalekites were not yet completely gone. Their presence would continue to linger in the shadows of Israel's history, waiting for another opportunity to strike. But with each battle, they came closer to the fate that had been decreed upon them, the day when their name would be erased forever. The time had come for the final judgment upon the Amalekites. For generations, they had tormented Israel, striking from the wilderness, raiding settlements, and defying the decree of God. Their name had become synonymous with treachery and destruction, and their sins had not been forgotten. The curse that had been spoken in the wilderness of Sinai was now about to be fulfilled. Israel, now ruled by King Saul, was strong, established, and ready for war. The Lord's command was clear. This was not to be another battle for survival, nor a war for territory. This was divine justice, a reckoning that had been decreed since the days of Moses. In 1 Samuel 15, verse 2-3, the word of the Lord came to Samuel, the prophet of Israel. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, I remember that which Amalek did to Israel, how he laid wait for him in the way, when he came up from Egypt. Now go and smite Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass. The command was absolute. This was not a war of conquest, but of eradication. Every man, woman, child, and even the livestock were to be wiped out. The Amalekites were beyond redemption, their fate sealed by their defiance of God's chosen people. Saul gathered his forces, summoning an army of 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 men of Judah. He marched against the Amalekites, striking them down with the overwhelming force of Israel's military might. The battle was fierce, but Israel's victory was certain. The Amalekites, once a people feared for their cunning and brutality, were now being hunted down as the judgment of God unfolded upon them. The city of Amalek was taken, and the slaughter began. It was a moment that should have marked the end of the Amalekite curse, a moment when the words spoken by God would be fulfilled, and Amalek would finally be blotted out from under heaven. But Saul faltered. Despite God's explicit command to destroy everything, Saul allowed his own judgment to interfere. He spared King Agag, the ruler of the Amalekites, and kept the best of the livestock, the oxen, the sheep, and the fattened cattle. Instead of total annihilation, he chose selective destruction, justifying his actions by claiming that the animals would be sacrificed to the Lord. But this was not obedience. This was disobedience disguised as religious piety, and it would cost Saul everything. When Samuel arrived at the camp of Israel, he immediately sensed that something was wrong. The sound of bleating sheep and lowing oxen filled the air, evidence that Saul had not followed the Lord's command. In 1 Samuel 15, verse 13-14, Saul greeted Samuel with confidence, saying, Blessed be thou of the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord. But Samuel was not deceived. He replied with piercing words, What meaneth then this bleating of the sheep in mine ears, and the lowing of the oxen which I hear? Saul, realizing that he had been caught, attempted to justify his actions. He claimed that the people had taken the best of the spoil to sacrifice unto the Lord, as if disobedience could be excused by religious ritual. But Samuel's response was swift and uncompromising. In 1 Samuel 15, verse 22-23, he delivered one of the most powerful rebukes in Scripture. Hath the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because thou hast rejected the word of the Lord, he hath also rejected thee from being king. These words sealed Saul's fate. His failure to fully obey God had cost him his throne. His kingdom would not endure, and another would be chosen in his place. But the most devastating consequence of his disobedience was not just his personal downfall, it was the survival of the Amalekites. By sparing Agag, Saul had unknowingly allowed the very people whom God had condemned to continue existing. Amalek, though severely weakened, would live on. Their destruction had been incomplete, and from the remnants of their lineage, new enemies would arise. Samuel, unlike Saul, understood the gravity of the situation. He would not allow Agag to escape justice. In 1 Samuel 15, verse 32-33, he summoned the Amalekite king before him. Agag, believing that he had been spared, approached with confidence, saying, "Surely the bitterness of death is past." But Samuel was not deceived. He looked upon the man who represented generations of hatred, a king who had led a people marked for destruction, and he declared, "As thy sword hath made women childless, so shall thy mother be childless among women." And with that, Samuel hewed Agag in pieces before the Lord in Gilgal. The judgment had been carried out, but it had come too late. Saul's failure to completely obey God had already set into motion consequences that could not be undone. Though Agag himself was dead, his lineage had not been entirely wiped out. Somewhere, among the survivors of the Amalekite people, his descendants remained. And from them, the spirit of Amalek would rise again. The war against Amalek had not ended that day. Though Saul had been given the chance to fulfill the divine decree, his compromise had allowed the Amalekites to endure. The very people whom God had sworn to erase from history would continue to exist because of one man's disobedience, and their survival would not be forgotten. The unfinished war between Israel and Amalek would carry on for generations, culminating in battles yet to come, when the last remnant of Amalek's bloodline would finally face the judgment that had been spoken in the days of Moses. Now, the story of Amalek would take another turn. Though they had suffered a great defeat, they were not yet extinct. The consequences of Saul's failure would be felt in the days ahead, for from the shadows of history, an Amalekite would rise in one of the darkest chapters of Israel's future. But before that final reckoning, their presence would continue to haunt the kingdom of Israel, as their descendants sought vengeance for the blood of Agag that had been spilled before the Lord. Saul's failure to fully obey God's command to destroy the Amalekites would have consequences that stretched far beyond his reign. By sparing Agag, he had allowed a spark of Amalekite survival to remain, a spark that would later grow into a flame of vengeance. Though Agag himself was executed by Samuel, his descendants lived on. The Amalekite bloodline had not been fully wiped out, and from that remnant, new threats to Israel would emerge. What should have been the final chapter in the war against Amalek had instead become yet another delay in their judgment. The consequences of Saul's disobedience did not take long to manifest. Though the majority of the Amalekite army had been decimated, small groups of survivors scattered across the wilderness, biding their time, waiting for the opportunity to rise again. The Amalekites were relentless in their hatred for Israel, and their desire for revenge ran deep. Their entire existence had been shaped by their opposition to God's people, and despite their heavy losses, they refused to disappear from history. The survival of even a small remnant meant that Amalek's war against Israel was not over. The lingering presence of Amalek would come to haunt Israel in unexpected ways. The most devastating example of this came centuries later, during the Persian Empire, in the form of Haman the Agagite, a direct descendant of King Agag. Haman, a high-ranking official in the court of King Ahasuerus, harbored an intense hatred for the Jewish people. This was not merely political ambition or personal rivalry. This was the deep-seated enmity that had existed between Israel and Amalek for generations. When Haman plotted to exterminate all the Jews in the Persian Empire, he was continuing the ancient war of his forefathers. The spirit of Amalek had not died with Agag. It had merely waited for another opportunity to strike. But just as God had delivered Israel from Amalek's attacks in the wilderness, he would once again intervene to stop their destruction. Through Queen Esther, a Jewish woman placed in a position of power by divine providence, Haman's plot was exposed and overturned. In a stunning reversal, Haman was hanged on the very gallows he had prepared for Mordecai, and the Jewish people were granted the right to defend themselves against their enemies. The survival of Israel and the destruction of Haman were not just political events. They were the fulfillment of God's judgment against Amalek, carried out across the centuries. Yet, even before Haman's rise, the Amalekites continued to plague Israel. Their remnants had not disappeared after Saul's failed mission. During the reign of King David, the Amalekites struck again in a brazen and devastating attack. While David and his men were away, the Amalekites raided Ziklag, a city where David's family and followers were staying. In 1 Samuel 30 verse 1-2, the Bible describes the destruction. And it came to pass, when David and his men were come to Ziklag on the third day, that the Amalekites had invaded the south and Ziklag, and smitten Ziklag, and burned it with fire, and had taken the women captives that were therein. They slew not any, either great or small, but carried them away, and went on their way. The Amalekites, knowing David was absent, seized the opportunity to attack. They burned the city to the ground and took all the women and children captive, including David's wives. This was yet another act of cruelty, another attempt to break Israel's spirit. But David, unlike Saul, understood that the only way to deal with Amalek was through complete destruction. He immediately sought the Lord's guidance, and in 1 Samuel 30 verse 8, God gave him a clear command. "Pursue, for thou shalt surely overtake them, and without fail recover all." David and his men set out in relentless pursuit of the Amalekites. Guided by divine providence, they discovered an abandoned Egyptian servant who had been left behind by the Amalekites due to illness. This man led them to the Amalekite camp, where they found the raiders celebrating their victory, feasting and drinking in careless arrogance. In 1 Samuel 30, verse 17, David launched a sudden attack. And David smote them from the twilight even unto the evening of the next day. And there escaped not a man of them, save 400 young men, which rode upon camels, and fled. David's victory was complete. He recovered every captive, every possession, and every spoil that had been taken. Not a single woman or child was lost. The Amalekites, who had tormented Israel for so long, had been nearly wiped out. But once again, some escaped. 400 young men fled on camels, preserving the Amalekite lineage for yet another day. This relentless pattern, Amalek rising, Israel defeating them, but some always surviving, continued for generations. The war that began in the wilderness had not yet reached its final conclusion. Amalek had been beaten again and again, but as long as any remnant remained, their hostility toward Israel would persist. Saul's failure had ensured that the battle against Amalek would stretch beyond his reign. His incomplete obedience had left the door open for future Amalekite attacks, culminating in the raids on Ziklag and the later emergence of Haman. His decision to spare Agag, which may have seemed like an act of mercy at the time, had in reality prolonged the suffering of Israel and allowed Amalek to continue their war against God's people. The story of Amalek was a warning to Israel and to all generations that partial obedience to God is no obedience at all. Saul had been given a chance to end the Amalekite threat once and for all, but he failed. And because of that failure, Israel had to face more centuries of Amalekite treachery, culminating in one of the greatest threats to their existence under Haman. But through it all, God remained faithful. Every time Amalek rose, he raised up deliverance for his people. The war against Amalek was not just a historical conflict, it was a spiritual battle, one that would continue until Amalek was completely erased, as God had commanded. Though the Amalekites would continue to make appearances throughout history, their fate was already sealed. The judgment spoken in Exodus, reiterated in Deuteronomy, and commanded in 1 Samuel 15 had not been forgotten. Saul had failed in his mission, but God's word never fails. In time, Amalek would be wiped out, their name truly blotted from under heaven. And when that day came, the long war between Amalek and Israel would finally come to an end. Now, as Israel moved forward under new kings and leaders, the remnants of Amalek lurked in the shadows, waiting for their next opportunity. But no matter how many times they returned, their fate was inevitable. The decree of God stood firm, and the day of their final destruction was drawing near. The story of Saul's failure is not just a lesson in history, it is a lesson in obedience. The consequences of disobedience do not fade with time. They ripple through generations, shaping destinies and influencing futures. And for the Amalekites, every reprieve was temporary. Their destruction was certain, delayed only by the failures of men. But when the final blow came, it would be swift, absolute, and eternal. The war was not over, but the outcome had already been decided. David had faced many enemies in his life, but none were as persistent as the Amalekites. Though weakened by past defeats, they were not yet gone. They had survived the slaughter in the wilderness, the wars of the judges, and even Saul's failed attempt at their extermination. Now, as David and his men roamed the land in exile, the Amalekites saw an opportunity for revenge. Their hatred for Israel was not just a lingering feud. It was an ancestral war, fueled by centuries of conflict and divine condemnation. And so they struck again, this time at a place most dear to David. While David and his men were away, the Amalekites descended upon Ziklag, a Philistine city that had been given to David as a place of refuge. David, though anointed to be king of Israel, was still on the run from Saul, and he had sought temporary shelter among the Philistines. Ziklag had become a home for David's warriors and their families, a sanctuary in a time of uncertainty. But to the Amalekites, it was nothing more than another target for plunder. In 1 Samuel 30, verse 1-2, the devastation is recorded. And it came to pass, when David and his men were come to Ziklag on the third day, that the Amalekites had invaded the south and Ziklag, and smitten Ziklag, and burned it with fire, and had taken the women captives that were therein. They slew not any, either great or small, but carried them away, and went on their way. The attack was swift and merciless. With David and his warriors absent, there was no one left to defend the city. The Amalekites pillaged every home, setting the entire city ablaze. But unlike previous encounters, they did not kill indiscriminately. Instead, they took every woman and child captive, leading them away as spoils of war. This was not just an act of cruelty, it was an act of deliberate provocation. They knew that David would return to find his home in ashes, his family stolen. They wanted him to suffer. They wanted him to know that Amalek would always rise again. When David and his men returned to Ziklag, they were met with devastation beyond words. The sight of their city in ruins and the realization that their families had been taken drove them to the brink of despair. In 1 Samuel 30, verse 4, the Bible describes their grief. Then David and the people that were with him lifted up their voice and wept, until they had no more power to weep. These were hardened warriors, men who had faced death countless times, yet in this moment they were broken. Some even turned against David, blaming him for what had happened, and spoke of stoning him in their anguish. But David did not give in to despair. Unlike Saul, who had lost God's favor, David was a man after God's own heart. Instead of seeking vengeance in his own strength, he turned to the Lord. In 1 Samuel 30, verse 6, it is written, "But David encouraged himself in the Lord his God." He knew that the only way forward was through divine guidance, and so he sought the Lord's will, calling for Abiathar the priest to bring the ephod, a sacred object used for seeking God's direction. David asked a simple yet crucial question. "Shall I pursue after this troop? Shall I overtake them?" And the Lord answered him without hesitation, "Pursue, for thou shalt surely overtake them, and without fail recover all." Armed with this promise, David set out with his men. He had no way of knowing where the Amalekites had gone, but God provided a means for him to find them. Along the way, they encountered an Egyptian servant, a man who had been abandoned by the Amalekites after falling ill. In their arrogance, the Amalekites had left him behind, not realizing that he would be the key to their downfall. The Egyptian, grateful for David's kindness, agreed to lead them straight to the enemy camp. What David and his men found was a scene of reckless celebration. The Amalekites, believing themselves victorious, were feasting, drinking, and reveling in the spoils they had taken from Ziklag and other cities they had raided. They were completely unprepared for what was about to happen. In 1 Samuel 30, verse 16, the moment of reckoning is described. "And when he had brought him down, behold, they were spread abroad upon all the earth, eating and drinking and dancing, because of all the great spoil that they had taken out of the land of the Philistines and out of the land of Judah." David wasted no time. With the fury of a man whose home had been burned and whose loved ones had been stolen, he launched a surprise attack. The battle lasted from twilight until the evening of the next day. It was a slaughter. In 1 Samuel 30 verse 17, the Bible records the scale of the destruction. And David smote them from the twilight even unto the evening of the next day, and there escaped not a man of them, save 400 young men, which rode upon camels and fled. This was no ordinary victory. This was a total annihilation of the Amalekite raiders. Every single warrior in their camp was cut down, their stolen goods reclaimed, their captives freed. David and his men recovered everything that had been taken. David recovered all that the Amalekites had carried away, and David rescued his 2 wives. Not a single person was lost. The enemy had stolen everything, but in the end, they gained nothing. Yet, even in this great victory, the pattern of history continued. 400 young men escaped on camels, disappearing into the wilderness. The Amalekites had once again suffered a near total defeat, but a remnant remained. No matter how many times they were struck down, a few always survived, ensuring that their bloodline and their war against Israel would continue. David's triumph over Amalek was one of the most decisive battles in their long history of conflict, but it was not the final one. Though the Amalekites had been shattered, they were not yet gone. Their lineage, preserved through these fleeing survivors, would reappear again in the years to come, once more seeking vengeance upon Israel. The Battle of Ziklag was a testament to the relentless nature of Amalek's war against God's people, but it was also a demonstration of God's faithfulness. When David sought the Lord, he was given both the command and the strength to recover what had been lost. Unlike Saul, who had disobeyed, David followed God's instructions completely, ensuring not only his victory, but also the safety of his people. Yet, the fact that a remnant of Amalek still survived was a reminder that the final judgment upon them had not yet come. As David ascended to the throne of Israel, the Amalekites, though broken, still lingered in the wilderness, waiting for another opportunity to rise. The war that had begun in the days of Moses had not yet reached its conclusion. Amalek, though diminished, had not yet been fully blotted out. Their fate remained sealed by divine decree. But until the last of them was wiped from the earth, they would continue to haunt Israel's history, striking whenever the opportunity arose. David's battle against Amalek was a victory, but it was not the final chapter. The remnant that had escaped on their camels carried within them the same defiance, the same hatred, and the same destiny. Though they had been broken time and again, as long as even one Amalekite remained, the war was not over. But their end was coming. And when it arrived, there would be no survivors. The name of Amalek, once feared across the wilderness, would one day be erased forever. The war between Israel and Amalek had lasted for centuries, stretching from the days of Moses to the reign of David. The Amalekites had survived multiple defeats, each time returning to strike again, refusing to be erased from history. But their fate had long been sealed by God's decree, and their end was drawing near. Their story would take one final fateful turn, one that would intertwine with the tragic fall of Israel's first king, Saul. It would be an Amalekite who would appear in the aftermath of Saul's death, delivering a chilling testimony that would lead to his own swift demise. Saul's reign had been marked by both triumph and failure, but his greatest failure had been his disobedience in sparing Agag, the Amalekite king. That failure had cost him his kingdom, and as he went into battle against the Philistines at Mount Gilboa, his fate was sealed. The battle was brutal, and Saul's army was overrun. His sons, including Jonathan, were slain, and Saul himself was wounded by enemy archers. Realizing that he was about to fall into the hands of the Philistines, Saul made a desperate decision. In 1 Samuel 31, verse 4, it is written, "Then said Saul unto his armor-bearer, Draw thy sword, and thrust me through therewith, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and abuse me. But his armor-bearer would not, for he was sore afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell upon it." Saul had taken his own life rather than face humiliation at the hands of the Philistines. His armor-bearer, seeing his king dead, did the same. The Philistines later found his body and desecrated it, hanging it on the walls of Beth-shan. The great king of Israel had fallen, and his kingdom had now passed to David. But the events surrounding Saul's death would take an unexpected turn when an Amalekite arrived at David's camp, claiming to have played a direct role in the king's final moments. In 2 Samuel 1, verse 2-10, an Amalekite came before David, presenting himself as the one who had ended Saul's life. He carried with him Saul's crown and bracelet, proof that he had been near the fallen king. He told David that he had found Saul wounded on the battlefield, unable to escape, and that Saul had begged him to finish the job. The Amalekite claimed that he had done as Saul requested, striking the final blow before taking the royal items as proof of his deed. So I stood upon him and slew him, because I was sure that he could not live after that he was fallen. But was the Amalekite telling the truth? His story conflicted with the account in 1 Samuel 31, which stated that Saul had taken his own life. This raised the question, was this Amalekite truly responsible for Saul's death, or was he simply a scavenger who had stumbled upon the body and saw an opportunity to gain favor with David? If he had been lying, it was the greatest mistake of his life. If he had been telling the truth, it was an even greater mistake. The irony of an Amalekite claiming responsibility for the death of Saul, the very king who had been commanded by God to wipe out Amalek, was striking. This was a moment soaked in poetic justice. Saul's failure to destroy Amalek had now led to his own demise at the hands of one of their own, whether through direct action or deception. But if the Amalekite thought that David would reward him for this act, he had gravely miscalculated. David, despite Saul's hostility toward him, still honored him as the Lord's anointed. Saul had hunted David for years, forcing him to live in exile and hiding, yet David refused to raise his hand against him. When David heard the Amalekite's words, his response was not gratitude, it was outrage. In 2 Samuel 1, verse 4-15, David rebuked him sharply. "How wast thou not afraid to stretch forth thine hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" And David called one of the young men and said, "Go near and fall upon him." And he smote him that he died. The Amalekite had sealed his own fate with his own words. Whether he had killed Saul or merely lied about it to gain favor, the result was the same. David had him executed on the spot. His body fell lifeless before the future king of Israel, another casualty in the long and bitter war between Israel and Amalek. Once again, an Amalekite had tried to gain an advantage through deception, but it had led only to destruction. But this was not the final blow to Amalek. Though Saul's failure had allowed some of them to survive, and though they had continued to raid and harass Israel, their last stand was approaching. David had already dealt a crushing defeat to them at Ziklag, but the ultimate reckoning would come later, when the Israelites finally hunted down the last remnants of Amalek and wiped them from history forever. In 1 Chronicles 4, verse 42-43, the Bible records what would be the final annihilation of the Amalekites. And some of them, even of the sons of Simeon, 500 men, went to Mount Seir, having for their captains Pelatiah and Neariah and Rephaiah and Uzziel, the sons of Ishi. And they smote the rest of the Amalekites that were escaped, and dwelt there unto this day. The judgment that had been declared in Exodus, Deuteronomy, and 1 Samuel was at last carried out. The Amalekites, who had tormented Israel from the time of the Exodus, were now no more. The final remnant was hunted down and destroyed. Their name, which had been spoken with dread, was now only a memory. The prophecy had been fulfilled. I will utterly put out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. With the destruction of this last remnant, the Amalekites disappeared from the historical and biblical record. They had fought for survival against the decree of God, but they had ultimately been unable to escape their fate. No nation could withstand the judgment of the Almighty, no matter how many times they rose again. Their cycle of defiance, destruction, and survival had finally come to an end. The war between Israel and Amalek had lasted for generations, but the verdict had never changed. From the moment they attacked the weakest of Israel in the wilderness, they had been marked for destruction. The battles fought by Joshua, Saul, and David had weakened them, but remnants had always escaped. Their cunning, their brutality, and their hatred had allowed them to endure for centuries. But in the end, it had all been for nothing. The sword of God's justice had fallen, and there would be no more survivors. The story of Amalek is not just one of war and conquest. It is a lesson in divine judgment. They had been given no room for mercy because their actions had proven that they would never change. They had lived by the sword, and in the end, they had perished by it. Their fate serves as a warning to all nations and all peoples. God's word will always be fulfilled. The name of Amalek had once inspired fear, but now it had been erased. Though history may forget them, the lessons remain. The Amalekites thought they could defy God's will, but their fate had been sealed from the very beginning. The war they waged was not just against Israel, but against God himself, and in the end, no enemy of God can stand. The Amalekites may have been wiped from history, but their legacy did not end with their physical destruction. Throughout Jewish and Christian traditions, Amalek became more than just an ancient enemy of Israel. They became a symbol, a representation of rebellion against God and the forces that seek to oppose his will. The spiritual meaning of Amalek extended beyond their historical battles, evolving into a deeper theological and moral lesson, one that continues to influence religious thought even today. In Jewish tradition, Amalek is not merely remembered as a hostile nation, but as the embodiment of evil itself. The command in Deuteronomy 25 verse 19, "Thou shalt blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. Thou shalt not forget it," was understood not just as a call for military action, but as a perpetual warning against forces that stand in opposition to divine truth. The name Amalek became synonymous with unprovoked aggression, cruelty, and the refusal to recognize God's authority. Rabbinic literature often portrays Amalek as more than just a historical people. They represent the spiritual enemy that seeks to lead humanity away from righteousness. This symbolism is deeply rooted in the way Amalek first attacked Israel. Unlike other enemies who waged war for land or political power, the Amalekites had no justifiable reason to attack Israel at Refidim. Their assault was purely an act of hatred, targeting the weak and the weary, those who lagged behind in the wilderness. This, in Jewish thought, represents the nature of evil, seeking out the vulnerable, preying upon the defenseless, and acting with cruelty for the sake of destruction. Thus, the battle against Amalek is not only a physical war, but a moral and spiritual one, an eternal struggle between good and evil. In later Jewish interpretations, various figures throughout history have been likened to Amalek. From Haman, the Agagite in the Book of Esther, who sought to exterminate the Jews of Persia, to more modern oppressors, the concept of Amalek has been used to describe those who engage in genocide, persecution, and relentless hostility toward the Jewish people. Some interpretations suggest that every generation faces its own Amalek, an enemy that seeks to destroy not only the physical existence of Israel, but also its spiritual foundations. This idea has led to theological discussions about whether Amalek is an ongoing force that manifests in different forms throughout history. In Christian thought, the Amalekites are also seen as a symbol of rebellion against God. Their defiance represents the carnal nature of humanity, the sinful inclination that resists divine authority. Some theologians interpret Amalek as a metaphor for the spiritual battles believers face. Just as Israel was commanded to continually fight against Amalek, so too must believers fight against sin and the forces that seek to separate them from God. The imagery of Moses raising his hands during the Battle of Rephidim is often seen as a representation of intercessory prayer, showing that victory over sin and evil comes not by human strength, but by dependence on God. The idea of the Amalekite spirit has also influenced modern thought in various ways. Some scholars and religious leaders suggest that Amalek is not just an ancient tribe, but a recurring archetype. Any nation, ideology, or movement that embodies cruelty, oppression, and the rejection of God's truth can be considered a manifestation of Amalek. This has led to discussions about whether certain historical events, such as the Holocaust or other genocides, can be seen as extensions of the Amalekite mindset. Though these interpretations vary, the underlying message remains the same. Amalek represents a force that must be opposed in every generation. Beyond religious contexts, the concept of Amalek has been used in political and philosophical discussions. Some see Amalek as a symbol of tyranny, totalitarianism, and any system that seeks to oppress the innocent. Others apply the idea more broadly, viewing Amalek as a representation of human cruelty and the capacity for evil within societies. In this sense, the battle against Amalek is not just a historical event, but an ongoing moral challenge, calling people to stand against injustice and wickedness wherever they arise. The question of whether there is an Amalekite influence in modern conflicts is complex and often debated. While some religious perspectives suggest that Amalek's legacy continues in ideological and cultural battles, others caution against applying the biblical concept too literally to contemporary events. Nonetheless, the enduring relevance of Amalek's story demonstrates the power of biblical narratives to shape thought, ethics, and the way people interpret struggles between good and evil. Ultimately, the story of Amalek is a lesson in the consequences of rebellion against God. Their destruction was not just a punishment for their hostility toward Israel, but a fulfillment of divine justice. They serve as a reminder that no force that opposes God can ultimately prevail. The command to remember Amalek is not merely about recalling a historical event, but about recognizing the ongoing struggle against wickedness in all its forms. The war against Amalek did not end with their physical annihilation. It continues in the hearts and minds of those who choose to stand against evil, uphold righteousness, and trust in the sovereignty of God. The story of the Amalekites is more than just a historical account of an ancient enemy of Israel. It is a profound lesson in obedience, divine justice, and the dangers of opposing God's will. Through every battle, every command, and every act of rebellion, Amalek serves as a warning to those who challenge God's authority and a reminder that His word always comes to pass. Their fate was sealed the moment they chose to strike the weakest of Israel in the wilderness, and despite their cunning and resilience, they could not escape the judgment of the Almighty. One of the greatest takeaways from this story is the danger of failing to obey God fully. King Saul was given a direct command to wipe out the Amalekites completely, yet he chose partial obedience, sparing King Agag and the best of the livestock. His decision may have seemed minor at the time, but it had far-reaching consequences. That single act of disobedience led to generations of continued conflict, and eventually an Amalekite descendant, Haman, would rise to threaten the Jewish people once again. Saul's failure cost him his kingdom, proving that God values obedience above sacrifice. The lesson is clear. When God gives a command, it is not to be questioned, altered, or rationalized. True obedience is complete and unwavering. The consequences of spiritual rebellion are another vital lesson from the Amalekite story. Amalek was not just an ordinary nation. They were a people who deliberately set themselves against God and His chosen people. Unlike other nations that waged war for territory or survival, Amalek attacked Israel out of sheer hatred, targeting the weak and defenseless. This unprovoked aggression was not just an act of war, it was an act of defiance against God Himself. And for this, they were cursed with total annihilation. Their existence became a symbol of all that stands in opposition to divine truth, showing that those who rebel against God will ultimately fall. No matter how powerful an enemy may seem, if they are against God, their destruction is inevitable. The importance of remembering history and its warnings is perhaps the most practical lesson we can take from this story. Throughout the Bible, Israel was commanded to remember what Amalek had done and to ensure that their name was blotted out. This was not just about wiping out a nation, it was about remembering the consequences of disobedience and rebellion. The battle against Amalek was not only a physical war, but a spiritual struggle that continued throughout the ages. Even today, the concept of Amalek is used to describe forces of evil, oppression, and defiance against God. The war may have ended in history, but its lessons remain relevant. Those who forget history are doomed to repeat it, and the story of Amalek serves as a powerful reminder that disobedience leads to downfall, and rebellion against God leads to ruin. Let's end with a powerful prayer. Wherever you are, repeat after me. Lord, thank you for the lessons we have learned from the story of the Amalekites. Help us to recognize the forces that oppose your will and to stand strong in faith. Give us wisdom to discern spiritual battles, courage to fight for truth, and a heart that seeks your righteousness. Just as you gave Israel victory over Amalek, help us to overcome every challenge, every enemy, and every obstacle that stands against your purpose. We trust in your power and we rest in your promises. In Jesus' name, amen. What are your thoughts on the story of the Amalekites? What part stood out to you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to hear your insights. Your engagement adds so much to this discussion, and I truly appreciate every one of you. If you found this video eye-opening and insightful, don't forget to like this video, share it with others who might find it valuable, and subscribe for more in-depth biblical teachings. Your support helps us continue producing powerful content that explores the hidden stories of the Bible. Thank you so much for watching and being part of this amazing journey through the story of the Amalekites. I truly appreciate your time, your curiosity, and your passion for diving deeper into God's Word. Stay strong, stay blessed, and I'll see you in the next video. God bless you all.